Thank you for joining the webinar today. Our topic today is securing funding for clinical trials. My name is Nancy Butcher, and I'm the co-director of Impact. I'd like to start the session today with a land acknowledgement. On a national level, we encourage all Canadians and visitors to Canada to learn about the Indigenous people of the lands on which they live, work, or visit, and become engaged allies together. We, as Canadians, in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, respect the self-determination of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, and their rights and responsibilities in cultures, languages, and the pursuit of wellness. So we have a few learning objectives for the webinar today. So the webinar today is centered around the ability to identify various funding strategies for pediatric and perinatal clinical trials in Canada, including academic grants and industry partnerships. The ability to develop realistic expectations regarding the timeline and effort required to fund clinical trials through shared examples, as well as to understand different strategies when approaching industry and academic funders, and the ability to identify those key factors, those secret ingredients for successful proposals when it comes to clinical trials. So we are very honored to have three esteemed speakers joining us today who are going to be sharing their various experiences and expertise around how clinical trial funding can be obtained in Canada. We are going to spend about 30 minutes with the speakers. They are going to go through their presentations. And as they're going through, please feel free to add any questions or comments or thoughts that you have in the chat. And at the end of that 30-minute period, we are going to open it up for a group discussion and a group question period. So we can come back to those questions at that time. You can also hold your questions until the end and simply raise your hand, or you can put them in the chat at that time. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Terry Lacaze and welcome him to this Impact webinar today. Thank you, Terry, for joining us.
Thank you, Nancy, Chelsea, and Lauren for organizing this webinar. And good morning, everyone. Good morning, my esteemed colleagues. I'm, very pleased to introduce these topics. I want to start by saying that I don't have anything to disclose apart from not having the ideal solutions to give you and provide you with, the right approach to be successful. So if funding a clinical trial, it's a very demanding and complex in process. It requires steps, preparations, thinking, and collaboration. So I'm going to go through a few ideas, a few things that I think you as fellows should know and should be aware. This is part of the mentoring and training component of this webinar. If I have, can I the first slides? Thank you. Let's get started by saying that there is no single bullet magic way of getting a clinical trial funded. It usually takes years of preparations, and it's a combination of different approach using different sources of fundings that needs to be somehow planified and organized over time. The academic source of funding is the one that we think is first. This is what essentially your local institutions provide, and there is a multiple opportunity locally to get some fundings. It's very rarely a large amount of fundings, but this is critical for the first years to get access to those funds and to determine and to establish different steps that will be required when you get to the larger organizations, the federal government, for a large grant. They will be asking you a lot of data and a lot of information that you need to acquire through the years, starting with identifying the questions, establishing partnership with colleagues, but also patients' organizations and patients' partners, determining the research questions, the outcome, those require some work that are not extremely expensive and can be funded through applications, to a local institution. There is a lot of opportunities there. It's a small amount of money, but this is by building step by step that you get, and you gather all the information that you will need for the pilot trials and then, the full-scale trials. Governments, so essentially CHR, but other provincial organizations provide large-scale grant. I think it's going to be the topic of SRIN, so I will not go through the detail of that. I want to emphasize the value of working with patients' organizations or philanthropic organizations in the space where is your interest. So if you are interested in subspecialties, you should start developing connections and working with organizations. They will be instrumental in the long term in the success of the grant. They will provide all the expertise from patients' partner, patients with living experience that you need to have a solid grant, but they may also provide you with some fundings to do some work around identifications of patients or establishing what should be the outcome of the trials. I will not talk too much about the industry partnership. We have a speaker for doing that, but this is also a key element that needs to be integrated in your career. Unless you are not, doing any trial or not considering trial in the drug space or in the pharma space, that might not be relevant to you, but most of you will interact at some points with industry. And I think it's important to establish the good relations right from the beginning and understand, how they proceed and what's the interest working with them. Having the right mentor is, I would think, absolutely critical and fundamental. Those 2 or 3 people that you will, work with over the 10 or 20 years of your career are going to be critical in, your success. So find out the right mentor and keep, the relations and ensure that, you receive the difficult feedback from your mentor. Mentorship is key. It's not just, saying, yeah, this is great, all goes well. You need to actually get the best of your mentor, particularly at the stage when you write a grant and you need the feedback. Being part of a training program, I don't have to talk about that today. This is what the Impact is doing, and I think it's critical to be well trained. And Impact is working on, ensuring that you have the appropriate training. Going to the right conference is actually also very important to establish contact and relations with colleagues that will be helping you in not only, getting a grant, but actually making the trial successful, through recruitments and other, expertise that those people will provide to the success. I mentioned, the importance of patients. I think this is going to be even more critical. We move, from no patients involvement at all long time ago. Now it's part, of, it's, I would say, so obvious that we need to do that. But I think we need to do that rightly. And for a clinical trial, clearly the engagements of patients, their involvement in determining, the best outcome, how those patients would be recruited. So having a pool of patient partners that provide not only their expertise from a living experience, but also they have themselves expertise. They are getting, trained to be patients partner. Mentioned the FAIR program, organized at McMaster. There are other programs for patients partner, but now they are extremely savvy and know very well how they can help you and make, your grant successful. Using innovative method, it's key. That's going to impact on the success of your trial, Bayesian approach, different way of recruiting patients, using new technology. Just want to emphasize that, unfortunately, not always the expertise to actually review and assess, those pieces on the grant, they are not always on the CHR panel. So make sure that when you really enter in something new and innovative, the grant is well written and there is no ambiguity, and the reviewers can actually understand what you are planning to do, because sometimes grant rejected because there is a misunderstanding or a lack of communications, between the applicants and the committee. Health economics, I think, is key and will be even more important. And we are going to look at not only efficacy and effectiveness, but efficiency. And I have to say that we are lacking right now expertise in health economics for clinical trial. We need to build capacity to help the trialists to have an understanding of why a trial is important, not only from an efficacy perspective, but also to basically save money to the system. So I suspect that, moving forward, more and more of the CHR committee will be asking for, so what, how it's going to actually affect the healthcare system beyond helping the family and the patients. And finally, I want to talk about the research environment, which I think is a key part of the grant as well. And as a reviewer, this is probably one of the pieces that I often found insufficient, not well explained. We don't really always see the support of the local institutions and the environments of the applicants and how the institutions will ensure that the trial when conducted at where is located the PI is actually done properly. Next slide. So what does it mean? It means that I would encourage, very early in the process to understand, to have the connections with the local institution expert, your clinical trial unit. There is a lot happening right now in the pediatric space at our institutions, a lot in terms of investments. Many institutions are investing heavily in developing clinical trial unit, clinical trial capacities, and you need to access to that. You need to understand how you can benefit from that, how much money you can bring from those institutions as an in-kind contributions in your grant, and showing the reviewer that there is a support, that this trial is going to actually happen because the institution sits behind you. ACT, as you know, the Accelerating Clinical Trial Consortium, is also supporting clinical trial units that are dispersed around the country. MyCern is one of those units, and we support clinical trialists by networking the CTU located at the pediatric institutions. So there is resources there that you can access to. It's not going to be money, but it's going to be service and expertise, and that's going to be key also in the success of your grant getting funded. Being part of a research network is also, I think, very important. And, in mind, we have a lot of network that has been extremely successful in getting funding in Canada. I'm thinking of PERC. The PER network is now, going ahead as well, developing an infrastructure that will allow investigators that join the network to be successful. At the first stage, you might be co-applicant on the grant, but you will play a role in participating to the success of the trial. But how those networks work is that there is some sort of anticipations of what's going to be in the next round. And then at some point, you will get, the role of nominated PI, because you will bring a new idea and the network will support you. So being embedded from the beginning and working collectively as part of a research network is important. At MyCern, we are offering also services. We are not offering money, but we can reduce significantly the cost of the trial by providing pre- and post-award services. And we can help, you when the trial is funded in taking care of different, aspects of the trial that will save money and save time and make your trial more successful. So please connect with us. There is, we have a website. Impact is actually part of those services as well. So we work very closely together to facilitate at the pre-award level. So before you submit the grant, making sure that your grant, include all the elements that will make, the success, particularly when you get funded and the trial, take place. And next slide. So I want to spend a couple of minutes on Rare Kid Scan, which is a pediatric rare disease clinical trial and treatment network that got funded last year. It's a 5-year grant. It's a trial that this is a network that has, the goal to bring more clinical trial to Canada and to help investigators in the rare disease space to get funded. So again, we provide pre- and post-award consultations. There is a lot of activities that are heavily subsidized by the network. So I encourage you to connect with me and with Brian Stewart, the director of the network. We have the websites. We also would like to offer you, if you are, of course, in the rare disease space, to become a methodological or clinical experts, on this network. So you have the barcode that can, direct you to the survey. By doing that, it means that, when we get requests from industry or for biotech or from other investigators, from different countries looking for an expert in the particular conditions, we would be able to connect you directly with those investigators, this biotech company. So it's one way for you to be, known and to get, a potential, idea and proposal from other investigators, or to be approached by industry for potentially being a site investigator. So there are different, opportunities for this network. So I encourage you to go to the websites and to connect with me. The next slide is about industry. I'm not going to go too much into detail. We have an expert, for talking about that. But I want to share a personal experience. I am a neonatologist. And when I started 25 years ago, when I was in France, I got involved in a couple of industry-sponsored trials as not only the local site investigators, but as the national expert. And I learned so much by being part, of this experience. I also made mistakes. And I think that working with industry can be challenging, but the only way to actually, understand and, get comfortable with that is to do it. So I really encourage you to work with industry, maybe to be at the beginning a site investigator, but very quickly you become an expert. They reach out to you. You can help them in the design of the trial, which is, I think, the most important piece, and they need experts. Have to navigate through the conflict of interest and all these things, but I think it's a very, a very good experience for young investigators, and we learn a lot. We also learn at some points how we can benefit from industry grant. I think we are going to talk about that later. Industry provide a lot of in-kind contributions. If you do a drug trial, they tend, to provide you with the drugs and the placebo, and there are other pieces that they can actually help as well. So this is a key element for drug trials, to have, a good understanding of how we work with industry and to work with them. We are now talking about large private-public partnership. I think it goes beyond, one individual. It's usually a group, a national network, but particularly in the rare disease space, we will see more of these private-public partnership that, provide opportunity for clinical trials and for investigators. Finally, I was asked to allude to the international funding opportunities. Next slide. So this is something that I think we have kind of, we tend to ignore, certainly at the beginning of our career, where we are focusing on the local, opportunities and then the national scope. But there is opportunities, and there will be more. That's, my feeling. Of course, things can change depending on, the evolutions of the political landscapes. But I think there are opportunities, particularly in the rare disease space, for international, grant. So one way to start thinking about that is to have a network of collaborators overseas. So basically, to start looking at who is actually interested in what you do in the other jurisdictions, in Europe, in the US, or in Australia, and establish contact with those people relatively early, so they know that you exist. And at some point, there will be funding opportunity in the country that might be, leveraged if you collaborate together. And there are good examples with CHR, where trials were funded, by CHR, but they were also funded in the US and in Australia and in the UK with the same, questions, the same design, which of course, maximize the sample size and increase, the ability to do large systematic review and patients, based individual patient systematic review and meta-analysis as well. So I encourage you to start looking at who is actually the people working in your field in the other country, And at some point, you will meet, you will go to conference, and you will start elaborating a research program where you can collaborate. I'm finishing with some funding opportunities that we are going to have access to in Canada. Canada has joined Horizon Europe in 2024 last year. So it means that today and for the next years, Canada will be able to access to a large pocket of funds in Europe. Of course, it's not going to be Canada alone. It will have to be Canada with some country. This Horizon Europe, program is very new, and I don't have much detailed information today, but I know that there will be information and webinar organized by CIHR and other federal agency to let the investigator aware of what's going to be the process. At some point, there will be call with priority for clinical trial between Europe and Canada. CIHR will provide a pot of funding that stay in Canada, but there will be an opportunity, of course, to be part of a very large team with European colleagues and to be funded for a large-scale clinical trial. So stay tuned. There will be more information coming, but we need to start establishing the collaboration. So anticipate that this is coming and look at potential collaborator in Europe. HERDERA is one of those programs. It's focusing on the rare disease. And again, there will be opportunities for people interested in the rare disease space to connect with investigators and to do large-scale grant, to be part of a grant. There will be money flowing from Europe to Canada, but also money provided by CIHR. It's a formal agreement between CIHR and HERDERA to contribute to funds. So there will be clinical trial opportunity as well for a rare disease that will be co-funded by Europe and Canada. I think I will stop there and I will hand over to Srin for the next presentations.
Thank you, Thierry. That was fascinating and wonderful to see. I'll sort of build on a lot of what Thierry has mentioned. I'm at the University of British Columbia. Hi, everybody. And thanks, Nancy Kelsey, for organizing this. This is a great session. I'm going to talk about how to get your idea into actually a funded reality. Thierry went into a lot of the places where one can go, and I'll walk through some of the steps to get there. Next slide, please. I have no financial disclosures to make. I will say, I think this is public. I think it's on a CIHR website somewhere. I've chaired the randomized control trial panel for the past couple of years, and I do it for the next couple of years. So I have reviewed a lot of grants and have had to think about this issue quite a bit. Next slide. Okay. I think fundamentally, one of the goals of when you write a grant to ask someone for money is to make it as bulletproof as possible. And I use the word bulletproof carefully in that reviewers will always look for small things to criticize. And this is what reviewers and peer reviewers always will do at journals, at grants, and everything else. And so trying to answer that question before it's even asked by that reviewer is your goal as you write your grant and write your proposal for a clinical trial. The next point is good ideas are many. We all sort of walk around in our daily lives, our clinical experiences and so on, and we can come up with a good clinical trial idea. Being able to implement the trial that answers that idea with public health impact is much, much harder. And so lots of other spaces in science are idea focused. The clinical trial space is implementation focused, and that you have to be able to prove that you can do the things to answer the questions raised by the idea. Next. So how do you get there? And I always like to talk about a program of research to justify the fact that one, you are the person or the group of people to answer that idea. And two, you will answer the idea with impact and utility, meaning how you ask the question in that is going to be relevant. And so to do that, oftentimes there needs to be a foundation of work to get there. And obviously every clinical trial idea is different and will require a different pathway to get there. If it's a novel drug, if it's a programmatic initiative, if it's a pathway of care or whatever, all of them have different pathways to get there. At the same time, they all have a fairly standard sort of foundation on which the clinical trial is the cherry on top almost. And so when I see a proposal that just has a clinical trial and has not done any of the background work to inform the clinical trial and making sure it's being asked in the most thoughtful and relevant way, it is less likely to move forward. So when we think about a program of research, and thinking about your idea, your space, or your clinical question, or whatever, it sort of starts from the very ground floor. And there's all sorts of other questions that are almost mandatory to be asked before you do the actual clinical trial. And some of these are surveys. And so asking around formally and scientifically around your care area, around your community, around your country about standards of care, what they do, whether a trial is feasible, and so on. This is often a great first publication for folks to prove that a track record is available and that they can navigate finishing a project, which is what always people look for as to whether lots of folks can start projects, whether folks can finish projects is really the test of whether something is feasible or not. Doing the actual observational study of the intervention, you're checking, do people use this intervention? What's the baseline rate of your primary outcome or your proposed primary outcome? All sorts of other sort of navigating questions to inform the sample size for your clinical trial and so on. And so it also proves feasibility, also proves that you can get a project together. And most fundamentally, with every clinical trial that's going to be clinically relevant now, being a multi-center clinical trial, builds that network, builds the people who will be involved in the subsequent clinical trials. And so if you're doing a multi-center trial eventually, doing a multi-center observational study with the same sites, the same team, the same people, really starts to hammer home that this is a project that has momentum. And momentum is so important when you review a proposal, to say that this has been building and building and building, and the clinical trial is just pushing things over the edge. Obviously, making sure no one else is asking the question in the exact same way and won't ask the same question and finish it before you is important. And so systematic reviews of trials that have been done and trials that are going to be done or are being done is very important. It may not be the exact same question, but if it's a similar question, then the value of doing your trial will have to be questioned. And most grants now really like having in the introduction or background a systematic review of the available evidence, so that folks can appreciate that this is an important time to do this study now. If this is relevant to dose finding or mechanistic study, after you finish your entire study, if you find no effect of your intervention, if someone says, okay, they studied the wrong dose or the wrong dose, so sorry, they should have done dose finding work at the beginning. And that's a common question that often comes up after a trial is finished. And so you have to be bulletproof, so to speak, to make sure that when you finish your trial, you'll have answered the question that's relevant to the community. And so that means doing this work at the beginning. Clinical trials are large investments in time, money, and energy. And so making sure that it's really done in the most careful way so that the question is done and not just asking more questions. People will often look for a pilot study in many ways. A pilot study is making sure things are feasible. So it's different than the observational study where you're just looking to see what people are doing. But the pilot study is doing the same trial you're hoping to do for your larger clinical trial and checking for feasibility metrics. Can you recruit? Can you screen? Can you capture the data you need? Can you follow up your patients in the appropriate timeframes? And so on and so forth. Oftentimes, this will be where the rubber hits the road, and you'll really start to realize whether this can be done or not done. And oftentimes, review panels will mandate these pilot studies be done so that we can get information as to whether you can actually get this stuff organized. Also, making sure you have the right primary outcome. Outcome definitions are so important. How we define an outcome, whether it's clinically useful, and making sure that the community that's going to be using this intervention, the providers and the participants and the patients, care about this outcome. And so some parallel work while all that's going to get the patient and get the primary outcome defined and defined well. Obviously, doing that with a large community of practice across a network is always important and useful and will help make your grant more fundable. Next. Yeah, and the last question is feasibility, feasibility, feasibility. Every grant will care deeply about whether something is feasible to be done or not. Once again, ideas are great. Can you do what you're proposing to do? How can you convince somebody who is by definition going to be skeptical and getting grants from all over the place that you can do the things that you are proposing to do? And it's hard to prove that you can do something outside of saying, trust me. What you can say is you can have a track record. A track record across a network. In theory, highlighted a lot of great networks across the pediatric space that you can say have worked with and have proven that they can recruit patients. You can say that you've worked with hospitals and research institutes that have track records of recruitment. The pilot data is so key here to say that you can actually screen and randomize and recruit patients. Feasibility will always be the sort of the last push for any grant review, and any grant reviewer will always really have to be carefully looking at whether this something is feasible or not. The worst thing a funder likes doing is funding a grant and then not having it complete, specifically for a randomized trial. And so proving feasibility is so important. Next. And so finally, good clinical trials ideas are many. Proving that the idea is important. What is the ultimate impact? Theory highlighted a bunch of these things, the economics, the patient's engagement, and so on. How you will define impact at the end is crucial to say that this is an important and prioritized idea. And the prioritization of which idea is going to move towards clinical trials is also part of that foundational work across clinical and other communities, saying people have called for this trial. People want this trial to happen. It's not just me and my idea. This is a larger momentum of saying that this is a question that the community wants to answer because of X, Y, or Z. And after I answer it, costs are cheaper, patients are getting better, or so on and so forth. Have a clear impact statement as to how this is going to change things. Next. Where to get money in Canada? I think Theory already highlighted that. Oftentimes people start small and it's the right place to start. And oftentimes you can do clinical trials for very cheap, particularly that original work, that like pilot work at a single center. If it's not an expensive intervention, you can do for a reasonably low cost. Obviously, there's other places to get money, provincial funding agencies. CIHR has twice-a-year project grant competitions, which reviews lots and lots of randomized trials, which is where sort of people mostly go for their larger scale trials, but also their pilot trials also. There's hospital foundations, there's departments, there's health authorities, and lots of places. And so I think that's a resource thing that I think Impact and MyCERN and other folks can help disseminate. Next. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Abel Ayola, who's going to provide her perspective.
Thank you so much. That was great. Hello, everyone. Very nice to meet you. I'm Abel Ayola. I lead the medical affairs organization at Johnson & Johnson Canada. I did my training here in Toronto and actually started as a sub-investigator. That's how I ended up getting into industry. Ultimately became a PI, ran phase 1 to phase 3 trials, and then moved into Johnson & Johnson. So it really gives me great pleasure to have this conversation with you because I think it's such an important topic and one that frankly has great impact for patients down the line. So I'm going to take you through what I plan to cover in the next 10 minutes or so. 3 key questions that I'm hoping I would have shed some light on. I think there's already been some terrific discussion and presentation on these topics, so I will try to be additive and not repetitive. The first was really how can researchers build relationships with industry? A little bit about pathways for funding. I think we've already touched on many of those already. So what I'll try to do is maybe add on some pieces that have not been talked about in detail. And then finally, how does industry decide who to approach to be an industry-funded site? And what I will share with you, even though I have a couple of bullet points there to speak to that, is that this is really a bi-directional relationship. So it's not just industry deciding who to partner with, it's also the sites deciding that they want to partner with a specific industry partner. So without further ado, let's jump into the first question. And I decided to answer a bit of this question with a bit of a reminder about the drug development chain for those of you that are interested in drug development down the line. There are many, many steps in this journey where you could potentially partner with industry. So at a very high level, I want to start off, first of all, just saying that this is an illustrative example. So the numbers here are just really for illustration of the scale of what's happening at each portion of development. But if you can imagine, we're starting with discovery of a molecule. We know now that with Gen AI, we hope that that will take a shorter period of time, but in the past, that often will take up to 4 years before you then move into preclinical development after identifying a couple of key molecules that you want to spend your time on. And then we move into clinical studies. So phase 1 to phase 3 trials. Phase 1 often being done in healthy volunteers, although it could also be done in patient population. Here really focused on safety, but also looking at dosing. And then as we move into phase 2 and 3, looking at broader groups of patients, continuing now to really drill down into the efficacy of a drug and continuing to assess the safety throughout that journey. By phase 3, we're usually doing very large studies with the thousands of patients. And this is really the package that is then taken to a regulatory authority, in the case of Canada, Health Canada, asking for drug approval. Now, when we get drug approval in Canada, that would be a notice of compliance, we still continue to do studies. So a lot of our phase 4 studies are done after a drug is actually available in the marketplace. And it could be for a variety of reasons. It could be to answer important questions about performance of a drug in the real world, but it could also be post-marketing commitments that we have with Health Canada. And so really this whole space of post-marketing studies is really a critical space. And if you think about real world evidence and the importance of that, this is also another area where you could get involved. So the short answer is that there's opportunity to partner with industry in all of these spaces. I think Terry made a really great point about how important conferences can be. Conferences are a great place to connect with a company if you're particularly interested in working with them. You go over to the booth and talk to an industry representative there. If not, there's also opportunities whenever you meet a representative. It could be a medical science liaison, it could be a sales representative, but really indicating to them your interest. And then what they would usually do is pull through and connect you to the right person in the company to have that discussion. What you will also see that may not be so very clearly depicted here is that some of this work is done at the global level, and some of this work can also be done at the local level. And in fact, sometimes we have global funding of very specific Canadian trials because we may have the top experts for that in the country. So I think lots of opportunity to partner with industry. The very last thing I will say about getting engaged, which I think was already mentioned, is this concept of coming in as a sub-investigator. It's a great way to learn about research. It's also a really exciting opportunity to then get mentorship from the more senior investigators and over time really building your capability throughout that journey. So if we can move to the next slide, let me take a few minutes now to talk about funding pathways. And I think there's already been great discussion about how you can get funding from hospitals, from provincial governments, from even potentially from patient organizations. What I want to do is just drill down into some of the funding pathways if you were requesting funding from industry. So 3 different mechanisms, although there are many more, I'm going to drill down on 3. One are really our company-sponsored studies. So if you think of our typical phase 3 large-scale studies, those would usually be company-sponsored studies. This is where the company is providing the funding, providing the support for a lot of the study activities, providing support with regulatory reporting. And really the investigators, there will be principal investigators as well as sub-investigators that would be responsible for the sites and the patients. Industry investigator-initiated studies are quite different In the case of the investigator-initiated studies, really the investigator is coming up with an idea that we are not soliciting. So the company doesn't come to you and ask you for an idea. That would be usually in the arena of a company-sponsored study, a potentially collaborative study. But you have an idea that you really want to have funded. And in that case, the investigator is taking on the role not only of the investigator, but also of the sponsor. This means that that person is responsible for all aspects of regulatory reporting, of site initiation, all of the things that the industry partner would usually do in the case of a company-sponsored study. So these can be quite exciting, but usually this is a space where it can happen. You really need to have a good understanding of good clinical practice and a really good understanding of health authority requirements to do these ones. And then collaborative studies are a little bit of a hybrid of the two. So in collaborative studies, these usually started initially in oncology, and that was the space where we're working with a lot of research groups, but I would say that now these really exist across the board. So often you would have a research group with a PI that is actually wanting to work with industry. The sponsor in this case would be that individual would be the research group or the individual PI, but the industry partner would do more than they would usually do in an investigator-initiated study. So an investigator-initiated study, we would provide support. You may ask for funding, some money, we would provide that money holistically, or you may ask for drug and we would provide that, but we would do nothing else. The entire study would be under the guidance and oversight of the investigator. In a collaborative study, it's a little bit more shared. Here, the company, even though we're not necessarily the sponsor, could provide support with certain study-related activities. They could also provide support from a monitoring standpoint. So it's more of a hybrid of the two that I spoke to above. And then multiple other funding options that we talked about already. Grants are one option. Certainly public-private partnerships where we have a pool of money that has been set aside for some things that are very important, strategically aligned, maybe very important for patients or the healthcare system. And then people would feed in grant applications and be selected. So just some ideas about funding pathways, and I'm happy to speak more about these during the Q&A. So now if we can move to my final slide. The last question I really wanted to touch on was site selection. But before I go into these bullet points, I really want to make the point that this is a two-way street. So while we think about all of these things as we consider site selection, it's also really important for the site to want to work with the industry partner. So let me start off with the whole concept of the investigator, right? The qualified investigator at that site really needs to have the requisite therapeutic knowledge. We need to know that they have experience in that area because ultimately they're going to be responsible for the patients that are put into that study. The second one is also a really important one. So access to the appropriate patient population being included in the trial. So you need to know your patient population. You could know this through, looking at your EMR or understanding the patients. But it's not just about having the patients in the environment. The access to those patients is really important. So if you have a whole bunch of patients, but they're all in another trial and none of them will be available for this particular study, that would not be a good one to get involved in. I think I've already talked about the importance of just knowledge of good clinical practice, GCP, experience with conducting clinical trials, that was already mentioned as well, and really the understanding of what does a health authority require from you for you to really be able to lean in and be successful. The fourth bullet point is also a really important one. So sometimes we have very, very engaged investigators who want to do a really important trial. But if the academic center or institution that you're at does not have the infrastructure or the capabilities to really drive this, then oftentimes we're really not able to move forward with that site. So that's a really important thing. The partnership with the institution is critical. And then the last one that I really want to spend some time on is this idea of prior settings. So this is where I said it's very much a partnership. It's a two-way conversation. Oftentimes there can be investigators that are experts. And so we've worked with them in the past. And what we will often be doing is looking back and saying, how did they do? Were they actually able to recruit the number of patients that we agreed on? But not only did they deliver that number of patients, what was the quality of the information or the site? So if we had an audit where there are major findings that we needed to be concerned about, where there was potentially impact on the data, and these are all of the considerations that come to bear when we make the ask or reach out to request that a site join a study. And then last but not least, budget and site cost considerations. So all of these are just some ideas about how we select our sites. Again, we can talk a little bit more in the Q&A, but I'm going to leave it there and pass it back to Nancy to get us started with the question and answer section. Thank you.